This third of 4 episodes will provide a brief survey, beyond those already mentioned concerning the apostles, of the development of early persecution against Christians stemming from the Greco-Roman populace, and especially that which reached the level of state sanctioning. As Christianity became progressively more known as distinct from Judaism, and its growth came increasingly from non-Jewish converts, confrontation within these pagan contexts also grew. The first of these persecutions, and perhaps the most disturbing, comes via the infamous Emperor Nero. Of this time, the historian Tacitus writes in his Annals concerning the fire in Rome in AD 64. But neither human help, nor imperial munificence, nor all the modes of placating heaven could stifle a scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. Therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and, when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of a charioteer or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. As we noted in the previous episode, evidence points towards both Peter and Paul having been martyred during Nero's reign. Not long after Nero, we have Domitian, who reigned 81 to 96 AD. Early church historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century AD, wrote, "When Domitian had given many proofs of his great cruelty, and had put to death, without any reasonable trial, no small number of men distinguished at Rome by family and career, and had punished without a cause myriads of other notable men by banishment and confiscation of their property, he finally showed himself the successor of Nero's campaign of hostility to God. He was the second to promote persecution against us. The teaching of our faith shone so brilliantly in the days described that even writers foreign to our belief did not hesitate to commit to their narratives the persecutions and the martyrdoms in it." Eusebius is careful to point out, nonetheless, concerning the results of a trial of certain Christians, and quoting Hegesippus, quoting Tertullian, "Domitian also once tried to do the same as he, for he was a Nero in cruelty, but, I believe, inasmuch as he had some sense, he stopped at once and recalled those whom he had banished." We learn of subsequent persecution in the empire during Trajan's reign, around 110 AD, through a letter addressed to him from Pliny, a governor of Bithynia. In it is revealed what might be considered a far wider sentiment held by a considerable portion of the populace against what appears to be a rapidly growing church clashing inevitably against the prevailing Roman culture. It bears quoting at length. He writes, "It is my custom to refer all my difficulties to you, sir, for no one is better able to resolve my doubts and to inform my ignorance. I have never been present at an examination of Christians. Consequently, I do not know the nature of the extent of the punishment usually meted out to them, nor the grounds for starting an investigation and how far it should be pressed. Nor am I at all sure whether any distinction should be made between them on the grounds of age, or if young people and adults should be treated alike, whether a pardon ought to be granted to anyone retracting his beliefs, or if he has once professed Christianity, he shall gain nothing by renouncing it, and whether it is the mere name of Christian which is punishable, even if innocent of crime, or rather the crimes associated with the name. For the moment, this is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time, with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution, for whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. There have been others similarly fanatical who are Roman citizens. I have entered them on the list of persons to be sent to Rome for trial. Now that I have begun to deal with this problem, as so often happens, the charges are becoming more widespread and increasing in variety. An anonymous pamphlet has been circulated which contains the names of a number of accused persons. Among these, I considered that I should dismiss any who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they had repeated after me a formula of invocation to the gods, and had made offerings of wine and incense to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought into court for this purpose, along with the images of the gods, and furthermore had reviled the name of Christ, none of which things I understand any genuine Christian can be induced to do. Others, whose names were given to me by an informer, first admitted the charge and then denied it. They said that they had ceased to be Christians 2 or more years previously, and some of them even 20 years ago. They all did reverence to your statue and the images of the gods in the same way as the others, and reviled the name of Christ. They also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honour of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust, and not to deny a deposit when called upon to restore it. After this ceremony, it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. But they had in fact given up this practice since my edict, issued on your instructions, which banned all political societies. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women, whom they call deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths. I have, therefore, postponed any further examination and hastened to consult you. The question seems to me to be worthy of your consideration, especially in view of the number of persons endangered, for a great many individuals of every age and class, both men and women, are being brought to trial, and this is likely to continue. It is not only the towns, but villages and rural districts too, which are infected through contact with this wretched cult. I think, though, that it is still possible for it to be checked and directed to better ends, for there is no doubt that people have begun to throng the temples which had been almost entirely deserted for a long time. The sacred rites which had been allowed to lapse are being performed again, and flesh of sacrificial victims is on sale everywhere, though up till recently scarcely anyone could be found to buy it. It is easy to infer from this that a great many people could be reformed if they were given an opportunity to repent. We glean even more from the preserved response from Trajan, wherein he writes in a rather clinical and measured fashion, quote, "You have followed the right course of procedure, my dear Pliny, in your examination of the cases of persons charged with being Christians, for it is impossible to lay down a general rule to a fixed formula. These people must not be hunted out. If they are brought before you and the charge against them is proved, they must be punished. But in the case of anyone who denies that he is a Christian, and makes it clear that he is not, by offering prayers to our gods, he is to be pardoned as a result of his repentance, however suspect his past conduct may be. But pamphlets circulated anonymously must play no part in any accusation. They create the worst sort of precedent, and are quite out of keeping with the spirit of our age." Contemporary with these happenings was Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, who, around that same year, was put on trial and sentenced to death by beasts at Rome. In one of the letters he wrote en route to his execution, we read of his embracing of martyrdom. Quote, "I am writing to all the churches, and I give injunctions to all men, that I am dying willingly for God's sake, if you do not hinder it." Next, we come to the reign of Hadrian, 117 to 138 AD. Hadrian doesn't appear to himself personally pursue any measures against Christians, instead insisting on the punishment of those who were bringing false accusations against Christians. Nevertheless, he tolerates a general persisting anti-Christian sentiment among Romans. Antoninus Pius, who reigns 138 to 161 AD. Historian, scholar, and author Paul Korestis remarks of this emperor that the simple fact is that after a lull of about 15 years under Hadrian, for which Christian writers cannot or do not show any concrete examples of violence against the Christians, Antoninus Pius's rule suddenly became known for its persecutions in the provinces, as is testified especially by Justin's two apologies, by Eusebius, and perhaps even by Aristides. Furthermore, the very first year of Antoninus Pius appears to start with the martyrdom of the Bishop of Rome, Telesphorus. The impression is that the enemies of Christianity suddenly realized that they had got their first chance after the long anti-Christian inactivity that followed Hadrian's rescript on the Christians. Of Marcus Aurelius, who reigns 161 to 180 AD, historian Kenneth Scott Latourette states that he, quote, heartily disliked Christians. During his reign, persecutions occurred, including one in Gaul. He goes on to note that under Commodus, who reigns 177 to 192 AD, quote, the unworthy son of Marcus Aurelius, persecution, at first continued, was later relaxed because of the intervention of his favourite, Marcia. Through her intercession, a number were released from hard labour in the mines, to which they had been condemned for their faith. Following Commodus's disastrous rule, Septimius Severus, who reigns 193 to 211 AD, though at first on amicable terms with Christians, soon changes his tune, issuing in 202 AD an edict against the conversion to both Judaism and Christianity. Consequently, a persecution ensues. After a period of relative peace, Maximus Thrax, who reigns 235 to 238 AD, rises to power and revives persecution. Following Maximus, another time of relative calm is experienced, but it isn't long and Decius becomes emperor, 249 AD, issuing an edict that will lead to the first state-sanctioned empire-wide persecution against the Christians. Basically, the edict required all citizens to procure certification of sacrifice to the Roman gods, something, obviously, no genuine Christian would be persuaded to do. These certificates, or libelli, literally little books, were, however, sometimes purchased by those seeking to avoid death or imprisonment. One reconstructed text from a number of preserved versions translates into English as follows. Quote, to the commission of, chosen to superintend the sacred offerings and sacrifices, from, son of, together with his brother and their wives, and his children, who comes from the village of, in the division of, and is domiciled in the village of, aged, and member of the household of, Petesiccubus, the great, the mighty, the immortal. I have always, all my life, without interruption, sacrificed and poured libations and manifested piety toward the gods, in accordance with the divine decree. And now, again, in your presence, in accordance with the edict's decree, I have made sacrificed, or poured a libation and sacrificed, and partaken of the sacred victims. Wherefore I present this petition, and I request you to certify this below. Thankfully, the Decian persecution was short-lived, as only 2 years after his rise to the throne, he also achieved another first, becoming the first emperor to die in battle, specifically against the Goths. Perhaps motivated in part by an urgency to appease the gods during a pestilence at the time, Decius's successor, Gallus, who reigns 251 to 253 AD, is instrumental in the ongoing persecution against Christians in some parts of the empire. It appears there was a belief that the growth of Christianity was causing a neglect of pagan practices, which in turn either drew the judgment of the gods or at least the withholding of their protective power. This persecution seems to have differed somewhat in its more strategic targeting of Christian leaders. Initially, they were commanded to perform an act of worship to the gods or otherwise face exile, while for others, prohibitions were put in place against the attending of churches or Christian cemeteries under threat of death. This persecution escalated and expanded a year later with increasing deaths, confiscations of property, banishments, and enslavements. It was only due to conflict with Persians and subsequent capture of Valerian, who reigned 253 to 260 AD, and who was Gallus's successor, that this persecution came to an end. Less and infrequent persecutions still continued, but more broadly speaking, there came a period of relative quiet. This endured until the next century, when the most pervasive of persecutions would manifest, with the rise in power of the Emperor Diocletian, who reigns 284 to 305 AD. This did not transpire immediately, perhaps due to there being Christians or pro-Christian members of his own household. Indeed, his very own wife and his own daughter. Added to this, there was also the wife of Galerius. Galerius was one of those who held the title of Caesar at the time, and it is this man who is believed to be the catalyst. Despite his wife's disposition, he appears to have remained a devout pagan and ambitious in his desire to usurp the emperorship. It is to this man the blame is more directly laid for the instigation of persecution in 303 AD. And yet, a third player adds fuel to the fire in 304 AD. Maximian, co-emperor with Diocletian, appears to make a further decree, thus causing what was started prior to now encompass the furthest reaches of the empire. Eusebius, contemporary with these events and figures in question, and who was himself at risk, seems to confirm the source of instigation deriving from the military sector, of which Galerius was a commander as Caesar, saying succinctly, "This persecution began with the brethren in the army." But he also writes theologically on the reasons for it beginning, saying of the church at that time, after a period of relative peace and prosperity, quote, "But when on account of the abundant freedom we fell into laxity and sloth, and envied and reviled each other, and monstrous hypocrisy and dissimulation rising to the greatest height of wickedness, the divine judgment with forbearance, as is its pleasure, while the multitudes yet continued to assemble, gently and moderately harassed the episcopacy." We note here also the contemporary observer Aphrahat, who records, "And also concerning our brethren who are in the west, in the days of Diocletian, there came great affliction and persecution to the whole church of God, which was in all their region. The churches were overthrown and uprooted, and many confessors and martyrs made confession." In total, the persecution, which lasted over a decade, involved, as Lachauret puts it, the destruction of church buildings, burning of sacred books, demoting of Christians from places of honour, and the enslavement of Christian household servants who would not abjure their faith. Further decrees ordered the imprisonment of the rulers of the churches, offered release to Christians who sacrificed to the old gods, and commanded torture for those who were obdurate. And so, we come to the end of our survey of the most prominent persecutions since the time of the Apostles, to the point in history just prior to what would become a new era in the development of the Church, with a purported conversion of Emperor Constantine and his edict decreeing official toleration of Christianity, and which would serve to almost entirely prevent further state persecutions for the remainder of the existence of the Roman Empire. And yet, there are more Christians suffering for the faith in recent years than the total sum of years we have so far covered. In the next episode, therefore, we will turn our focus to the still much-needed theological aspects of persecution, and the practical teachings and applications provided for us so richly throughout the New Testament.